The evening sun was painting the sky orange when Justice Harold Washington turned his car onto Maple Street. At 72 years old, he drove carefully, keeping both hands on the wheel of his 10-year-old Honda Accord. Most people would never guess that this quiet man in a simple gray cardigan was one of the most powerful judges in America. Harold had just left his granddaughter's piano recital at the community center. Little Amy had played Chopin's Minute Waltz, and even though she stumbled a bit in the middle, her grandfather's heart swelled with pride. He could still hear her nervous giggle when she finished and saw him clapping in the front row. The neighborhood he was driving through looked like something from a magazine. Perfect lawns stretched between large houses with circular driveways. Street lamps were already flickering on, casting warm pools of light on the sidewalks. Harold didn't come to this part of town often, but Amy's recital had been at the fancy art center here, and now he was just trying to find his way back to the main road. He drove slowly, checking street signs and squinting a little in the fading light. Harold had never been one to make a fuss about things, even when he became a Supreme Court justice 5 years ago. He still drove his old car, still wore clothes from department stores, and still preferred quiet evenings at home to fancy parties. His late wife used to tease him about being too humble for his own good. 3 blocks behind him, Officer Derek Mills was having a different kind of evening. Mills had been patrolling this wealthy neighborhood for 8 years, and he knew every street, every house, and most importantly, every person who belonged here. In his mind, that's what made him good at his job, knowing what fit and what didn't. When Mills spotted the Honda moving slowly down Maple Street, something felt off to him. The car was too old, too plain for this neighborhood. And when he pulled up closer at the next red light, he could see the driver through the rear window, an elderly black man alone, driving carefully like he was lost or maybe looking for something to steal. Mills had seen this before, or at least he thought he had. People from the wrong neighborhoods coming into wealthy areas, checking out houses, maybe planning break-ins. Sure, the old man looked harmless enough, but that's what made some criminals so dangerous. They looked innocent. The light turned green, and Mills watched the Honda continue down the street. The driver put on his turn signal way too early, then seemed to change his mind and kept going straight. Definitely lost, Mills thought, or casing the area. Harold was indeed a bit lost. He'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and was now trying to remember which way led back to the highway. The streets all looked the same with their perfect houses and manicured gardens. He turned on his radio quietly, hoping to catch a traffic report that might help him figure out where he was. Classical music filled the car, the same Chopin piece Amy had played earlier. Harold smiled, remembering how she'd bowed so formally, after finishing, just like her piano teacher had shown her. These were the moments that mattered most to him, not the important cases or the formal ceremonies at the courthouse. Mills followed the Honda for 2 more blocks, growing more suspicious with each turn. The driver was definitely acting strange, slowing down to look at house numbers, pausing at stop signs longer than necessary. Mills had been a cop for 15 years, and his instincts were usually right about these things. Harold finally spotted a street sign he recognized, Oak Avenue. If he turned left here, he should be able to find his way back to familiar territory. He put on his signal and made the turn, grateful to be heading in the right direction. The classical music was soothing, and he found himself humming along, quietly. But Mills had made up his mind. Something wasn't right about this situation, and it was his job to protect this neighborhood. The expensive houses here were home to doctors, lawyers, and business owners, people who deserved to feel safe. If this old man was up to no good, Mills would stop him before anything happened. Mills hit his lights and siren. Harold saw the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. He'd been driving carefully, following all the traffic laws, so he couldn't imagine what he'd done wrong. Maybe the officer needed to get past him quickly to respond to an emergency. Harold pulled over to the right side of Oak Avenue and put his car in park, but instead of speeding past, the police car pulled up behind him and stopped. Harold's hands started to shake slightly as he reached for his wallet. He'd never been pulled over before, not in 50 years of driving. His wife used to joke that he drove like somebody's grandfather even when they were young. Mills sat in his patrol car for a moment, running the Honda's license plate through his computer. Clean record, registration up to date, no warrants. But that didn't mean anything. Criminals were smart these days, and an old man with a clean car was perfect cover for checking out potential targets. Harold waited patiently, his hands folded in his lap. The classical music was still playing softly, but now it felt strange and out of place. Through his mirror, he could see the officer getting out of his car, and something about the man's posture made Harold's chest tighten with worry. This was supposed to be a perfect evening, ending a perfect day with his granddaughter. Instead, Harold Washington, one of the most respected legal minds in the country, sat in his modest car on a quiet street, wondering what he had done wrong and hoping this would all be over quickly. Officer Mills walked toward the Honda with heavy steps, his right hand resting on his service weapon. This was standard procedure for him when dealing with suspicious situations, though Harold couldn't see this from his driver's seat. The old man sat perfectly still, waiting respectfully for the officer to approach. Mills tapped on the driver's window with his knuckles, harder than necessary. Harold jumped slightly at the sharp sound, then slowly rolled down his window. The evening air felt cool against his face, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the nearby gardens. "License and registration," Mills said without any greeting. His voice was sharp and unfriendly, nothing like the polite tone Harold expected from a peace officer. "Of course, sir," Harold replied quietly. His voice carried the dignity of someone who had spent decades speaking in courtrooms, though he tried to keep it soft and non-threatening. "May I ask what I did wrong?" Mills didn't answer the question. Instead, he studied Harold's face through the window, looking for signs of guilt or deception. The old man seemed calm, maybe too calm. In Mills's experience, innocent people were usually more nervous when they got pulled over. Harold reached slowly for his glove compartment, making sure to move his hands where the officer could see them. His late wife had taught him this after watching too many news stories about traffic stops gone wrong. "Be careful, Harold," she used to say. "Some people see danger where there isn't any." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Mills barked, even though Harold was being perfectly careful. The officer's tone made Harold's heart race faster. This felt different from what he'd expected. This felt dangerous. "I'm just reaching for my registration, officer," Harold said calmly. "It's right here in the glove box." He pulled out a small folder containing his car's paperwork, then slowly reached for his wallet to get his driver's license. Mills snatched the documents from Harold's hands and walked back toward his patrol car to examine them. Under the streetlight, he could see the name clearly: Harold Washington. The address was from a middle-class neighborhood across town, not anywhere near here. Mills felt his suspicions growing stronger. Harold waited in his car, classical music still playing softly from his radio. Chopin's gentle melody felt strange now, like a lullaby in the middle of a nightmare. He thought about Amy's recital earlier, how proud and happy she'd looked. He wished he was home right now, calling to tell her again how wonderful her performance had been. After what felt like forever, Mills walked back to the car. But instead of handing back the documents, he leaned down to the window with a cold stare. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Mills asked. The question came out like an accusation, as if Harold had no right to be on a public street. Harold blinked in surprise. "I was driving home from my granddaughter's piano recital, officer. I took a wrong turn and got a bit lost." He spoke truthfully, with the same honest tone he'd used throughout his legal career. "Whose car is this?" Mills continued, ignoring Harold's explanation completely. "It's mine, sir. I've owned it for about 10 years now." Harold's voice stayed patient, but inside he felt a growing sense of disbelief. Why was this officer treating him like a criminal? Mills studied the registration again, then looked back at Harold. Something about the old man's calm confidence bothered him. Most people from Harold's neighborhood acted more nervous when they got pulled over in areas like this. This guy was too comfortable, too sure of himself. "Step out of the vehicle," Mills ordered suddenly. Harold's stomach dropped. "Officer, I don't understand. What have I done wrong? I was just trying to get home." I said, "Step out of the vehicle, now." Mills's hand moved closer to his weapon, a gesture that made Harold's blood run cold. Harold had no choice. He turned off his car and slowly opened the door, moving carefully to avoid any sudden motions that might be misunderstood. At 72, getting out of a car wasn't as easy as it used to be, but he managed it with as much dignity as he could maintain. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Mills commanded. Harold couldn't believe what was happening. In all his years as a lawyer and judge, he'd never been treated this way. But he also knew that arguing with an aggressive officer could turn a bad situation into a deadly one. Harold placed his hands on the roof of his Honda and stood quietly while Mills began searching through his pockets. The officer's hands were rough and invasive, checking every pocket and patting down Harold's cardigan and slacks like he was looking for weapons or drugs. "Please, officer," Harold said quietly. "I'm just an old man trying to get home. I haven't done anything wrong. That's what they all say," Mills replied, continuing his unnecessary search. He found Harold's wallet, cell phone, and car keys, but nothing suspicious. Still, something felt off about this whole situation. A few neighbors had started to notice the commotion. Across the street, a woman walking her dog stopped to watch. 2 houses down, a man came out onto his front porch with his arms crossed. Harold could feel their eyes on him and felt a deep shame that had nothing to do with any wrongdoing. Mills opened Harold's wallet and looked through it more carefully. Credit cards, a few dollar bills, some family photos, and a driver's license that matched the car's registration. Everything checked out, but Mills wasn't ready to let this go. "You live on Elm Street," Mills said, reading from the license. "That's pretty far from here. You sure you weren't checking out these houses? Maybe looking for something to steal?" The accusation hit Harold like a physical blow. In his entire life, no one had ever suggested he might be a thief. He'd built his career on honesty and integrity, spent decades fighting for justice, and now he was being treated like a common criminal on a public street. "Officer, I give you my word that I was simply lost," Harold said, his voice still steady, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "I'm not a criminal, I'm just trying to get home to my family." But Mills had already made up his mind about what kind of man Harold was, and nothing the old judge said was going to change that. Mills wasn't satisfied with just searching Harold's pockets. Something about this whole situation still bothered him, and he'd learned to trust his gut feelings over the years. The old man was too calm, too polite. Most people would be angry or scared by now, but this guy just stood there taking it like he had all the time in the world. "Turn around," Mills ordered. Harold slowly turned to face the officer, keeping his hands visible at all times. The streetlight cast long shadows across both their faces, making the scene look like something from a movie that Harold never wanted to be part of. "I'm going to need you to sit down on the curb while I call this in," Mills said, pointing to the concrete edge where the street met the sidewalk. Harold's heart sank even further. Sitting on a curb like a common criminal was the last thing he'd ever imagined happening to him. But he also knew that refusing would only make things worse. At his age, he couldn't afford to have this situation turn physical. "Officer, is that really necessary?" Harold asked gently. "I'm not going anywhere, I just want to cooperate and get this misunderstanding cleared up. Sit down, now." Mills' voice left no room for argument. Harold walked slowly to the curb and carefully lowered himself onto the cold concrete. His knees protested after the long day, and sitting on the hard surface was uncomfortable for a man his age. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional pain of being treated this way. The woman across the street with the dog had pulled out her phone and was clearly recording everything. Harold noticed her, but tried not to look directly at the camera. The last thing he wanted was for his granddaughter to see her grandfather being humiliated on social media. Mills walked back to his patrol car and got on his radio. Harold could hear bits and pieces of the conversation, words like "suspicious individual" and "doesn't belong in the area." Each phrase felt like another weight added to his shoulders. More neighbors had come outside now. A couple stood on their front porch 3 houses down, whispering to each other and pointing. An elderly woman peered through her curtains from across the street. Harold felt like an animal in a zoo, except the visitors weren't there to admire him. A teenager walking by slowed down when he saw what was happening. He pulled out his phone and started recording too. Within minutes, Harold realized that his humiliation was being broadcast to the world in real time. The boy was clearly streaming live, talking quietly into his phone about what he was witnessing. "This is crazy," the teenager whispered to his phone. "They got this old man sitting on the curb like he robbed somebody. He looks like my grandfather." Harold closed his eyes and tried to think about something else. He thought about Amy's piano recital, how beautiful she'd looked in her white dress with the blue ribbon in her hair. He thought about his late wife and how she used to say that dignity wasn't something others could take away from you. It was something you had to choose to keep. Mills finished his radio call and walked back toward Harold. The officer had called for backup, not because he thought Harold was dangerous, but because he wanted another pair of eyes on the situation. Sometimes these things got complicated, and it was better to have witnesses. "My supervisor is on the way," Mills announced as if this was good news. "We're going to get this all sorted out." Harold nodded quietly. He wanted to ask how long this would take, but he sensed that any questions would just irritate the officer more. Instead, he sat on the curb with his hands folded in his lap, trying to maintain what dignity he could in an impossible situation. The teenager with the phone had been joined by two of his friends. They stood about 20 feet away, all of them recording and streaming live. Harold could hear them talking about what they were seeing, their young voices full of disbelief and anger. "This ain't right," one of them said. "That man didn't do nothing. Look at him. He's just sitting there being respectful." "I know, right? My dad would lose his mind if somebody did this to my grandpa," another replied. Their comments reached Harold's ears, and while he appreciated their support, he also felt embarrassed that these young people had to witness such treatment. They were learning a hard lesson about how the world really worked, and Harold hated being the example. Mills noticed the growing crowd and felt a bit of pressure. He'd expected this to be a quick stop, maybe scare the old man a little and send him on his way. But now there were witnesses everywhere, and people were recording everything. He needed his supervisor to show up soon. Harold's phone, which Mills had placed on the roof of the car, started ringing. The sound cut through the evening air, and Harold recognized the ringtone. It was Amy calling, probably to thank him again for coming to her recital. "Can I answer that?" Harold asked politely. "It might be my family wondering where I am." "No," Mills said firmly. "Don't touch anything." The phone kept ringing for what felt like forever before finally going to voicemail. Harold's heart ached, thinking about Amy trying to reach her grandfather, not knowing that he was sitting on a curb being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. More cars had slowed down as they passed by. Some drivers pulled over to see what was happening. A few more people got out with their phones, adding to the growing crowd of witnesses. What had started as a quiet evening on a peaceful street was turning into a public spectacle. Harold sat on the cold concrete and watched his dignity slip away with each passing minute. Every car that slowed down, every phone that captured his humiliation, every whispered conversation between neighbors. It all added up to a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the embarrassment. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in America, this same scene was playing out with other innocent people who didn't have the protections that Harold's position would eventually provide. He thought about all the black men who had endured this treatment and worse, with no recourse and no justice waiting for them at the end. Harold Washington, one of the most powerful judges in the country, sat on a curb in handcuffs and waited for help to arrive. The sound of another police car approaching made Harold's stomach tighten even more. Red and blue lights flashed against the houses as Sergeant Rodriguez pulled up behind Mills' patrol car. She'd been having a quiet evening shift when the call came in about a suspicious person stop, but something about Mills's tone on the radio had made her decide to respond personally. Rodriguez stepped out of her car and immediately noticed the crowd that had gathered. At least 15 people stood around with phones pointed at the scene, and she could see the glow of live streams on several screens. This was exactly the kind of situation that could blow up on social media and cause problems for the whole department. "What do we have here, Mills?" Rodriguez asked as she walked over to where Harold sat on the curb. She was a 15-year veteran who'd worked her way up through the ranks, and she prided herself on being thorough and fair. Suspicious individual driving through the neighborhood, Mills replied quickly. Claimed he was lost, but his story didn't add up. I'm running his information now. Rodriguez looked down at Harold, taking in his appearance more carefully than Mills had. She saw a well-dressed elderly man in a clean cardigan and slacks, sitting quietly with his hands folded. His posture was straight despite his uncomfortable position, and there was something about his bearing that struck her as unusual. Sir, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, she said to Harold, her tone more professional and respectful than Mills had used. Can you tell me what happened here tonight? Harold looked up at her with tired but hopeful eyes. Good evening, Sergeant. I was driving home from my granddaughter's piano recital when I got lost in this neighborhood. Officer Mills pulled me over, and I've been trying to cooperate fully, but I'm not sure what I've done wrong. There was something about Harold's voice that caught Rodriguez's attention. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone used to being listened to, someone accustomed to choosing words carefully. It wasn't the voice of a man up to no good. Mills, let me see his license, Rodriguez said, extending her hand. Mills handed over Harold's driver's license, looking slightly annoyed that his supervisor was questioning his judgment. Rodriguez studied the license under her flashlight. Harold Washington, 72 years old, address on Elm Street. The name seemed familiar somehow, but she couldn't quite place it. Something was nagging at the back of her mind. Mr. Washington, she said, what do you do for work? I'm a judge, Harold replied simply. He didn't want to make a big deal about his position, but he hoped it might help clear up this misunderstanding. Mills snorted. Yeah, right. And I'm the governor. But Rodriguez felt her blood run cold. Washington. Judge Washington. She'd heard that name before, seen it in the news. Her mind raced as she tried to remember where she'd encountered it. What kind of judge, sir? She asked, her voice becoming more careful. I serve on the Supreme Court, Harold said quietly, watching as Rodriguez's face changed completely. The sergeant's eyes went wide, and she took a step backward. Supreme Court Justice Harold Washington. She'd seen his photo in newspapers, had read about his appointment 5 years ago. The realization hit her like a truck. They had handcuffed and humiliated one of the most powerful people in the country. Mills, Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper. Uncuff him. Now. What? Sarge. I don't think. I said uncuff him now. Rodriguez's voice carried the authority of someone who wouldn't be questioned twice. Mills looked confused, but reached for his keys. I don't understand. He's just some old man from across town. Rodriguez pulled Mills aside and whispered urgently in his ear. Harold couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could see Mills's face change from confusion to shock to pure terror. The officer's hand started shaking as he unlocked Harold's handcuffs. I am so sorry, sir, Rodriguez said to Harold as soon as the cuffs were removed. There's been a terrible misunderstanding here. Harold stood up slowly, rubbing his wrists, where the metal had been. The crowd had grown even larger and phones were still recording every moment. He could see the teenager from earlier talking excitedly into his camera, probably telling his viewers about the dramatic turn of events. Justice Washington, Rodriguez continued, using his proper title now. I cannot apologize enough for what has happened here tonight. This is completely unacceptable. The word justice rippled through the crowd like a wave. People who had been watching started murmuring to each other, and Harold could hear fragments of excited conversation. Did she say justice? Like Supreme Court justice? Oh my God, they arrested a Supreme Court judge and this is going to be everywhere by tomorrow. Mills stood frozen beside his patrol car, staring at Harold like he was seeing a ghost. The full weight of what he'd done was starting to sink in. He'd handcuffed and humiliated one of the 9 most important judges in America. His career was probably over, and he knew it. Officer Mills, Harold said, turning to face the man who had treated him so poorly. I want you to know that I don't wish you any harm, but I hope you'll think about what happened here tonight. I hope you'll remember that every person you stop is someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone who deserves to be treated with basic respect. Mills couldn't meet Harold's eyes. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, but the words were barely audible. Rodriguez was already on her radio, calling her captain and probably preparing for the storm that was about to hit the department. Harold could hear her saying things like major incident and need damage control immediately. The woman with the dog from across the street approached carefully. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "I recorded everything that happened. If you need it for anything, I have it all on my phone." Harold nodded gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind of you." More people were coming forward now, introducing themselves and offering their recordings as evidence. The teenager who'd been streaming live had hundreds of viewers commenting in real time, and the story was already spreading across social media faster than anyone could control. Harold's phone rang again, probably Amy calling back after her earlier call went to voicemail. This time, Rodriguez quickly handed him the phone. "Grandpa, where are you? Mom said you should have been home by now." Harold looked around at the chaos surrounding him, the police cars, the crowd, the cameras, the flashing lights. How could he explain this to his granddaughter? "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said gently. "I just got a little delayed. I'll be home soon." As he hung up the phone, Harold realized that his quiet evening had just become national news. By the time Harold finally made it home that night, his phone hadn't stopped ringing. News reporters, fellow judges, old law school friends, and family members from across the country were all trying to reach him. The teenager's live stream had been shared thousands of times, and the video was spreading faster than wildfire across every social media platform. Harold sat in his favorite armchair, still wearing the same gray cardigan from earlier, and watched the news coverage of his own humiliation. The anchor spoke in serious tones about a shocking incident of racial profiling while showing footage of him sitting on the curb in handcuffs. It felt surreal, like watching something that had happened to someone else. His daughter called from California, her voice shaky with anger and concern. "Dad, I can't believe what I'm seeing on the news. Are you okay? Do you need me to fly out there?" "I'm fine, honey," Harold assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just tired. It's been a very long day." Amy's mother called next, apologizing repeatedly for suggesting the arts center in that neighborhood for the recital. Harold had to convince her that none of this was her fault, that Amy's beautiful performance had been worth everything that came after. Within hours, the story had reached the major news networks. Harold's face was on television screens across America, but not in the way he'd ever imagined. Usually when Supreme Court justices made the news, it was for their legal opinions or major court decisions. This was different. This was personal. Next morning, Harold's quiet neighborhood was invaded by news vans and reporters. His phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was the Chief Justice calling to check on him and offer the full support of the court. "Harold, this is outrageous," the Chief Justice said. "The whole court stands behind you. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do about this, we're with you." Harold appreciated the support, but he was still processing what had happened to him. He'd spent his entire career believing in the justice system, working to make it fair for everyone. But last night he'd experienced firsthand how that same system could fail so completely. By noon, the police department had called a press conference. The chief of police, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform, announced that Officer Mills had been suspended pending a full investigation. He apologized to Justice Washington and promised that changes would be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the damage was already done. The video of Harold sitting on the curb had been viewed millions of times. People were angry, and they had every right to be. Protests began forming outside the police station with signs reading, "Justice for Justice Washington," and "Stop Racial Profiling Now." Harold knew he had a choice to make. He could stay quiet, let his lawyers handle everything, and try to move on with his life. Or he could use this terrible experience to shine a light on a problem that affected countless others who didn't have his platform or protection. After 3 days of constant phone calls and media attention, Harold made his decision. He would speak publicly about what had happened, but he would do it his way. The press conference was held at the courthouse where Harold had presided over hundreds of cases. He stood behind the same podium where he'd announced important legal decisions, but this time he wasn't speaking as a judge. He was speaking as a black man who had been wronged. "Good afternoon," Harold began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had made him such a respected jurist. "3 nights ago, I was driving home from my granddaughter's piano recital when I was stopped, searched, handcuffed, and humiliated for no reason other than the color of my skin. The room was packed with reporters, but it was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop." Harold continued, his words measured and careful. "I want to be clear about something. What happened to me happens to black men across this country every single day. The only difference is that most of them don't have the privilege of my position to bring attention to the problem." Harold paused, thinking about all the men who had endured similar treatment with no recourse, no voice, no justice. "I could be angry. I should be angry. But anger alone won't fix this problem. We need real change, better training for police, officers, accountability for those who abuse their power, and a recognition that every person, regardless of their race or background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." The questions from reporters came fast and pointed. Would he sue the police department? Would he call for Officer Mills to be fired? What changes did he want to see? Harold answered each question thoughtfully. Yes, there would be accountability. Yes, there would be consequences. But his focus was on preventing this from happening to others. Officer Mills made a choice that night, Harold explained. He chose to see a threat where none existed. He chose to assume the worst about a stranger, based on nothing but prejudice. Those were his choices, and he'll have to live with the consequences. Within weeks, Officer Mills was terminated from the police force. The department implemented new training programs on racial bias and community policing. The incident became a case study in police academies across the country. But for Harold, the real victory came months later when he received a letter from a young black law student who had watched his press conference. The student wrote about how Harold's grace under pressure had inspired him to continue fighting for justice, even when the system seemed stacked against him. Harold kept that letter in his desk drawer, right next to a photo of Amy at her piano recital. Both reminded him of what really mattered, the next generation and the world they would inherit. The incident changed Harold in ways he was still discovering. He found himself more aware of the experiences of others, more conscious of his own privilege, and more determined to use his position to create positive change. Every time he put on his judicial robes now, Harold remembered that night on Oak Avenue. He remembered sitting on that curb, feeling helpless and humiliated, and he carried that memory with him into every decision he made from the bench. Justice, Harold had learned, wasn't just about legal precedents and constitutional law. Sometimes, it was about an old man driving home from his granddaughter's recital, hoping to be treated with the same dignity he would show to any stranger he met. That simple hope, Harold realized, shouldn't be too much to ask for in America. But until it became reality for everyone, there was still work to do.